There we Okay, so hi everyone, and welcome to our second event for our Bradshaw Conference series in celebration of a quarter century of cultural studies at Claremont Graduate University. We wish to acknowledge the Kizh and Tongva people upon whose ancestral homelands this university resides. My name is Nadine Chan, and I teach in the Cultural Studies Department here at CGU. This conference series, titled Futurity and Future Publics, seeks new conceptual tools and methods to interrogate the field of cultural studies amid the precarious task of imagining futures under conditions of precarity, disenfranchisement, and inequality. For a schedule of all our events, including panels on Afrofutures, the Decolonized Museum, abolitionist futures, and more, please check out our website, which I will link to shortly in the chat. Today's panel turns to the topic of ecological futures. Allow me to give a brief introduction of our panel and our speakers. Amid questions of planetary degradation, irreversible climate change, species loss, and other human and non-human born crises, questions of futureness and futurity are deeply pressing. Given our long histories of inequality, disempowerment, and displacement set in motion by the uneven violences of racial capitalism and colonialism, it has become increasingly evident that the possibility of resilient futures are accessible to the few, but excluded for the many. This panel discusses new imaginaries for radical futurisms in this moment of ecological emergency. So in terms of the format for today, after the presentations, we will then have a brief conversation with me as a discussant, which will be followed by what I hope will be ample time for Q&A with the audience. The event uses the Zoom webinar format, which means, members of the audience unfortunately won't be able to appear on screen if you have a question. So instead, please do post your questions using the Q&A function in the chat below, and we will pull them up. This webinar will also be recorded and will be available on our conference website. And before we get into it, I also want to thank Laura, Kate, and Eileen, and also our chair, Ivo Ishii, for putting together this wonderful conference and making it possible for us to have this event today. So I will introduce the speakers now, and then we'll start with TJ, and then Jess will follow up. Our first speaker is TJ Demos, who is the Patricia and Roland Robelli Endowed Chair in Art History in the Department of History of Art and Visual Culture at University of California, Santa Cruz, and founding director of its Center for Creative Ecologies. Demos is the author of numerous books, including Against the Anthropocene, Visual Culture and Environment Today, Decolonizing Nature, Contemporary Art and the Politics of Ecology, The Migrant Image, The Art and Politics of Documentary During Global Crises, and Return to the Post-Colony Specters of Colonialism in Contemporary Art. He also co-curated Rights of Nature, Art and Ecology in the Americas at Nottingham Contemporary in January 2015, and organized Specters, a Cine Politics of Haunting at the Reina Sofia Museum in Madrid in 2014. During 2019 to 21, with the Center for Creative Ecologies and as a Getty Research Institute scholar, he's working on a Mellon-funded research project, art exhibition, and book project dedicated to the questions, what comes after the end of the world, and how can we cultivate futures of social justice within capitalist ruins? His new book, Beyond the World's End, Arts of Living at the Crossing, was recently released by Duke University Press. And our second speaker for today, Jessica Hurley, is Assistant Professor of English at George Mason University and the author of Infrastructures of Apocalypse, American Literature and the Nuclear Complex. Her work has appeared in, how do you pronounce it? Simplicity, Mediations, Comparative Literature Studies, Commonwealth Essays and Studies, American Literature, Extrapolation, Frame, the Faulkner Journal, and the edited collection, The Silence of Fallout, Nuclear Criticism in a Post-Cold War World, and been recognized by the Don D. Walker Prize in Western Literature, the 1921 Prize in American Literature, and the Jim Hinkle Memorial Prize. In 2018, she co-edited a special issue of ASAP journal titled Apocalypse. So without further ado, Professor Demos, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Nadine. It's great to be here. Thanks for everyone for coming. I'm really honored to be invited and pleased to be speaking along with Jessica Hurley. So I look forward to the discussion after my roughly 25-minute max presentation. So I'm speaking today from Santa Cruz, or rather the unceded territory of the Waswas-speaking Upi tribe, where the Amamutsan tribal band, comprised of the descendants of indigenous people who have suffered so greatly under Spanish and US colonization, is today working hard to restore traditional stewardship practices on these lands and heal from historical trauma. And now I will share my screen and begin my presentation, which is entitled Abolition Ecologies, Insurgent Universality, Solidarity, and Worlds to Come. With her compelling contribution to indigenous futurism, Thurza Jean Cuthand's Reclamation from 2018 documents what's to come. It's a 13-minute video. I'm not going to show clips of it because there's not really time, but you can see it and watch it on YouTube and at that link below. So premised upon a mass settler exodus to Mars, the short video portrays a broken, abandoned Earth left to indigenous peoples who, freed of extractive devastation, toxic racism, repressive heteronormativity, and the endless wars and violence of capitalist property relations, subsequently begin the work of post-colonial environmental restoration. Delivered through familiar documentary tropes, the piece showcases interviewees, as in the still, discussing their newfound lives, with contextualizing footage of dystopian landscapes like this one, presented in the evidentiary mode with a handheld camera's reality effects. Its futurism unleashes radical formal possibilities in both decolonizing time, reversing conventional documentary's ties to pastness, projecting the that which has been into the what's to come, and generating forces of creation beyond the mimetic doubling of reified and colonized realities. It thereby lays an explosive charge in the present through performative imagination, rendering the future as disruption that much more probable. Here, documentary figures as the creative practice of chronopolitics, designating the politics of time as much as the time of politics, both implying there's nothing natural or inevitable about how we organize temporality. As such, documentary provides a technology for revealing portals into futures alternative to the now, recalling Arundhati Roy's description of the current pandemic conjuncture. Structural breakdown discloses newfound possibilities and opportunities for a creative transformation of what's yet to be. Passing through that portal, we can cast a barrier of eternity between the barbarism of the present and the justice of the hereafter. The stakes are indeed enormous. We're caught in a situation in which time has been colonized, racialized, and economized, generating what Black quantum futurism, the Afrofuturist collective based in Philadelphia, term the temporal ghettos of racial capitalism, where the master's clockwork universe unevenly distributes spatio-temporal mobility, agency, and determination. Just as material inequality reigns, we also succumb to the endless present of capital's calculative machinery, its seemingly rendering resistance pointless. Time operationalized as such recalls what Jasbir Puar terms prehensive futurity, a chronology that inevitabilizes a desired unfolding. She writes, we cannot get out of the present because we're tethered to the desired future. Past, present, and future feel somewhat futile as descriptions of temporal distinctions, end quote. So conventional documentary tends to reify that time trap. Cuthand's Reclamation, a decolonization of time as much as of space, poignantly contests dominant approaches to time, including techno-libertarianism's prehensive futurity and its colonialism of land, the economy, and the infosphere of communications as much as of temporality. It's as if its vision of what's to come is a foregone conclusion, as when the tech billionaire and entrepreneur Elon Musk, who in response to charges of complicity in the 2019 anti-democratic political takeover in Bolivia, in part to secure lithium reserves for global markets, including for his own Tesla cars and SpaceX project, tweeted, "We will coup whoever we want, deal with it." Performing the hegemonic futurity to which we're all tethered, Musk pushes extractive colonial capitalism into any and all territories, including outer space, as well as into infinity. And thankfully that coup in 2019 in Bolivia was itself overturned in 2020 by the elections that brought the movement for socialism back into power. But Musk's project, and more broadly speaking, techno-libertarian futurity, entails destroying the lands, waters, and life chances of frontline communities worldwide, producing a growing class of the indebted, the vulnerable and disenfranchised, subjected to all manner of police violence, incarceration, and growing deaths of despair, on top of mounting climate disasters, existential insecurity, and pandemic emergency. Given the resulting desperation, our forlorn present has triggered blunt expressions of time resistance. Like Alicia Wormsley's project, There Are Black People in the Future, placed recently in halting all-cap white letters on a black billboard in Detroit, Michigan, as well as on various artistic objects, sculptural pieces, and installations and in films. Wormsley's revolt against being defutured, elaborated in a proleptic tense of the present impending, a chronopolitics of prefiguration, resonates with the ongoing battles over public monuments and their removals. These highlight the otherwise suppressed violence of colonialism and slavery and their aftermath, past and present conflicts over heritage being inextricable from the very social production of the future, which also indexes the stakes of documentary and artistic practice more broadly today. Who has the right to produce the future? And I love this piece which shows Kennedy George and Ava Holloway performing ballet in front of this monument in Richmond, Virginia, dedicated to the Confederate General Robert E. Lee, but attacked in all sorts of ways in terms of the graffiti on the pedestal in the background, which provides the backdrop for their performance. Radical futurisms have arisen in recent years to assert this right, the right to produce the future, articulated through speculative visions of times to come, as witnessed internationally in the formation of creative practices pledged to decolonizing the not yet. These rescue open potentiality from the grips of capitalism's algorithmic capture, its technogenic determination, and its biosecurities of control. Building on the precedents of Afrofuturisms of decades past, when Black sci-fi and musical experimentation projected an emancipated technological presence in years ahead, as fictionally dramatized and historicized in Black audio film collectives, film The Last Angel of History from 1996. These practices now generate new configurations of documentary in multiple sectors, including those of indigenous futurisms, trans and queer futurisms, multi-species and socialist futurisms, and more. One modeling is Black quantum futurism's documentary Chronopolitics, which materialize video assemblages like this one and photo montages that unleash the force of radical reversibility. They target time zones that keep racialized bodies locked in oppressive cells, fortified by all manner of temporal encasements, unchanging pasts, presences of indolence and criminality, and defutured existential voids. And from these, they break out. As with their 2019 video, Black Space Agency training video, which again, you can see online at that link below. In the video, overlapping images blur into illegibility and shapes mirror and mutate, mimicking soundscapes filled with echoes and reverberations, all emanating from a deep psychic space of traumatic collective memory in the afterlife of slavery, in Saidiya Hartman's words, and in the recent past of housing segregation. Foregrounded as well in the experimental music of Black Quantum Futurism member Kame Ayewa, also known as More Mother, sonic elements perform like their visual analogs as so many fugitive elements, oftentimes ripped from appropriated sources of violence. Some are sourced from deadly encounters with anti-Black police brutality, as with the sound piece, The Afterlives of Events, Time Distortion from 2016, which you can listen to on SoundCloud, with its torturous audio mixed with brutalist electronica, representing Sandra Bland's violent arrest by police in Texas before her suspicious death in jail. They write, this is Black Quantum Futurism, "We believe that astrological events are reversed and act retrocausally from the cosmic future to influence present events that will be subsequently written on the fabric of the past by light and sound." Such is a recipe for futurism's transformative power in the present. With Black Space Agency and associated collages, BQF graphs the techno-optimism of past space travel, dramatized in astronaut imagery, and mirrored in helmets reflecting Black faces onto newspaper clips, reporting unfulfilled urban housing justice dreams, resonating with the goals of their Black Quantum Futurism Community Futures Lab that operates in North Philadelphia, where BQF member Rashida Phillips works also as a housing rights lawyer. Their cultivation of spatial agency then is juridico-political and geographical as much as aesthetic and temporal. Indeed, the challenge is how to constellate their pulsating lights and sounds to gain the future they want, ripped from the contradictions of racialized inequalities in resource allocation. As their video quotes Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., as valid today as it was in 1966 when he said, "There is a striking absurdity in committing billions to reach the moon where no people live, while the densely populated slums are allocated minuscule appropriations." And we could key here Gil Scott-Heron's piece, Whitey on the Moon from 1970, which again speaks volumes to the present context of, for instance, Elon Musk's desire to colonize Mars. These uneven geographies are also upended in Jean Cuthand's Reclamation, resonating with the resounding world historical project of decolonization as demanded by indigenous formations like Idle No More in the Canadian context, and more recently, the Red Nation, based in Albuquerque, New Mexico. For them, decolonization represents the abolition of dominant economic arrangements and socio-political systems organized around extraction and exploitation, bringing to an end more than 500 years of colonial history and making way for future collective emancipation. The video's performative power constructs its subjective viewership as an emancipated people to come on land evacuated of oppressors, which bears on how solidarity might operate today, particularly in settler colonial territories like North America. Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang have by now famously argued that non-native solidarity with indigenous emancipation must avoid what they term settler moves to innocence, or goodwill ally gestures that practice the metaphorization of decolonization by denying its essential meaning, the return of land and sovereignty to indigenous peoples. Without anchoring those superficial gestures in that latter's radical meaning, metaphorizing acts which facilely extend decolonization to this and that, whether decolonizing the university or sexuality, as necessary as those also are, in their words, problematically attempt to reconcile settler guilt and complicity and rescue settler futurity. Ultimately, for Tuck and Wang, settler accomplices can only accept in what they call an ethic of incommensurability when it comes to solidarity, relinquishing settler futurity, abandoning the hope that settlers may one day be commensurable to native peoples, which in turn requires an understanding of uncommonality that uncoalesces coalition politics, as they write. Accepting uncommonality leaves us recourse to alternatives like those presented in Radical Black Praxis, which they also cite, dedicated to the undercommons and a permanent fugitivity, as elaborated by people like Fred Moten and Stefano Harney, where the refusal of property and possession of land as much as conventional subjectivities is the ethical truth of emancipated social experience and the only possible basis for decolonial solidarity. That's exactly what Cuthand's radical futurism offers to non-Indigenous viewers via documentary form, a subjective non-place, dispossession, and permanent fugitivity. And this precisely because the decolonized what's to come is devoid of settler colonialism's oppressive subjects. So with the viewer, with the video, non-Indigenous viewers experience their own disappearance. They become accomplices in the abolishing of whiteness as a structure of racial division and colonial oppression, I would argue. That said, one might propose conversely as well that demetaphorizing decolonization shouldn't end in the uncoalescing of coalition politics, but rather reveal new forms of solidarity on that basis. Indeed, there's an urgent need for such alliances now more than ever, given present hyper-partisanship, social media atomization, and ethno-nationalist reaction, in order to build collective power to disrupt the constancy of colonial capitalist violence that harms us all, if differentially, sociopolitically and economically. Writing from yet another Indigenous radical perspective, Nick Estes of the Red Nation argues that Indigenous futurity is and must be universal. In his words, it isn't just for Indigenous people, he writes, it's essential for the very existence of life on the planet. What's required is a social revolution that turns back the forces of destruction, uniting Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in common struggle against capitalism and colonialism. So instead of uncoalescing differences, another option is unifying in support of their abolition, which documentary and our artistic practice might also abet. At this speculative limit is infinity minus infinity. The Audlith Group's 2019 film linking racial capitalism with colonial genocide, perpetuated during the Anthropocene's beginnings in the 16th century conquest of the Americas. Now, this film is harder to see. It's not available publicly, but you can see clips online. And there are screening opportunities that come up ever so often. So I highly encourage people to look for opportunities to see this. It's a feature-length film about 90 minutes long. It's really amazing. So the film's genealogy builds further to the hostile environment of recent British migration policy, especially that affecting the Windrush generation of migrants living both in the afterlife of slavery and in the post-colonial wake of empire. The Windrush generation referring to those arriving in the UK from Caribbean islands between 1948 and 1971, only to have their residency status and also their citizenship questioned and even rejected decades later by recent British xenophobic migration policies. The film's cinematic allegory traces these complex historical networks as mediated by performance, dance, recital, and historical truth-telling, spoken by figures, some of whom appear as trans-temporal deities, like in the still that you're looking at here. With them, the video choreographs what the artists call a choreopoetics, approximating an aesthetic form of collective speech inspired by the Black arts movement poet and playwright Ntozake Shange, and the script drawn from diverse sources, including the writings of Jamaican poet Una Marsan, Martinican philosopher and poet Edouard Glissant, the Brazilian sociologist Denise Ferreira da Silva, and British geographer Catherine Youssef. One central character, this one, appears many-headed, as if an Indo-futurist trope signaling multiple realities, or a future of many futures, in a time-splitting act of metaphysical and even cosmopolitical import. With Ferreira da Silva, the artists speculate about a blackness beyond capture, an infinity beyond infinity, in the place of the subjectivity long denied to those of the African diaspora by European Enlightenment modernity. And they're thinking of this text, which appeared in eFlux in 2017 in particular. Documentary is consequently in the Audlith Group's hands, keyed to a future indeterminate, to the ultimately uncapturable zone of the decolonized fugitive. Ferreira da Silva discusses blackness as antimatter, or, quote, negative life, unquote. That is, life that has negative value, as instrumentalized historically by Europe's universal measures in defining whiteness as its counterpart and the height of self-actualizing reason. The latter, fortified by racial oppositions gained through colonization and enslavement, with all of the sociological, economic, and representational violences that were cause and consequence of that inequality, including also a long history of documentary anthropology. From its negative use value to white reason and the dialectics of race, blackness in Ferreira da Silva's deconstruction, however, opens onto indeterminacy, topologically connected to the infinite and uncontainable, approximated in Infinity Minus Infinity by turning the eyes, ears, and fingernails of figures into corporeal portals to other worlds. This is accomplished through a kind of biopolitical montage in which bodily orifices and surfaces provide screens of layered videos within videos, revealing ever new scenes from the racial capitalist scene, or the geological epoch shaped by colonial capital, offering a more precise descriptor, I think, than the Anthropocene. Defining then a documentary of allegorical immensity, the film's voiceover culminates in speculating about an eventual future resolve of liberation, but only when those myths have been incorporated in one into another and recognized as constituent parts of the before and afterlife of slavery and the never-ending colonial project. So this gets to the heart of how to think emergency and apocalypse today when we're confronting a future climatological catastrophe, but we can't think it without reflecting as well on the history of the many apocalypses of the past that go back 500 years. So in conclusion, reverberating with Cuthand's reclamation, as well as Black quantum futurism's layered chronopolitics, Infinity Minus Infinity's performative documentary proposes something like an abolitionist double negative, both catalyzing one, a disidentification not only from white supremacy, but from the very logic of racial difference, and two, compelling the nullification of the very systems, the legal and economic institutions, the techno-social and educational infrastructure, the effective and aesthetic practices that have reproduced it, those forms of racial differentiation historically and into the present. And here there's two other references I wanted to put on the table which are important to this presentation. One is the insurgent universality that Max Tomba has talked about, a solidarity understood politically, beginning with the renunciation of one's particular identity. It belongs to a practice of disbelonging to a specific social position in order to open up the possibilities of an insurgent universality, or a universality from below, a democratic excess with a necessarily empty center, always incomplete, and a necessary step beyond the limits of particularism. And the recent book by Assad Haider called Mistaken Identity, which discusses further approaches to political emancipation through this kind of insurgent universality. So it's only appropriate then that the Autolith group, in seeking to grant aesthetic form to this complex movement of a deeply historical futurism, finds recourse in the imagery, as you see on the screen here, of two black holes in the background colliding, creatively adopting a recent computer simulation from the California Institute of Technology that shows that awesome astronomical event detected for the first time ever by the Laser Interferometer Gravitational Wave Observatory. Roughly 30 times the mass of the sun, each black hole contains a gravitational singularity wherein space-time curves infinitely. The film operates then in the time space between those black holes, I would suggest, after a past of unforgivable debt in the afterlife of slavery, and facing a future filled with indeterminacy beyond reified difference. Its many portals then reveal a not yet of racial disruption, of radical disruption from a history that must be obliterated but never forgotten. At its best, speculative documentary and aesthetic practice unleashes cosmopolitical force and provides the building blocks, the forms, events, affects, the poetics of new worlds. The challenge then remains to organize the social movements to bring them into actuality. All right, thank you.
Thank you so much, TJ. That was a wonderful and really inspiring talk, which gave us a lot to think about. And so next up we have Jessica Hurley. I've already done the introductions, right? Yes, I have. So do take it away.
All right. Uh-oh. There we go. As you can see from that little preview, we're going to have some really interesting overlaps with TJ's amazing talk, which is quite an act to follow, but I will do my best. So first, thank you to Nadine and Claremont for inviting me. Such a pleasure to be here. I want to acknowledge that I'm calling in today from Manahoac land and voice my support for land back and Indigenous sovereignty initiatives, ideally less metaphorical than more. So we've come here today to talk about environmental futures. Yet, as the Cultural Studies Department points out in its description of this anniversary series, imagining futures has become a precarious task. In environmental theory, the response to the apocalyptic futures that we face has been to reject apocalypticism and demand that we cultivate hope for and an effective attachment to a brighter version of the future, as if it is our failure to imagine and commit to better environmental futures that is to blame for those futures failing to appear. Addressing the question of how we live in precarious times, Donna Haraway asks, how can we think in times of urgencies without the self-indulgent and self-fulfilling myths of apocalypse? Rebecca Solnit uses apocalypse as a synonym for easy despair, while Timothy Morton argues that the strongly held belief that the world is about to end unless we act now is paradoxically one of the most powerful factors that inhibit a full engagement with our ecological coexistence here on Earth. But what if the insecurities of the now demand that we take apocalypse more seriously? To be precarious, to be in crisis, is to exist in a condition of foreclosed futurity. In this talk, I will propose that we take this condition seriously, that we do not immediately seek to retrieve the future that we've lost, but rather dwell in the futurelessness in which we find ourselves. This is a manifesto for apocalypse, for futurelessness as a way out of the ecological and social realities imposed on us by the ongoing processes of settler colonial racial capitalism. Apocalypse is often thought of as the end of time, but the exact quality of the time that is being ended is rarely questioned or defined. Time's arrow is the linear vector from Genesis to Revelation, tracing its flight from origin to telos. It's what we talk about when we talk about apocalypse. one straight line that organizes us from beginning to end, apocalypse is the opposite of multitemporality. This is hegemonic time. Benjamin's homogeneous, empty time that organizes the world along an axis of progress towards a teleologically fixed future. Like other hegemonic forms, teleological time serves as a mechanism of abjection. This mechanism has been theorized in the field of critical temporality studies, a transdisciplinary research focus across the humanities and social sciences that finds its sharpest expressions in Black, queer, Indigenous, feminist, disability, and post-colonial studies. Such scholarship analyzes how power and legitimacy are activated through different temporal frameworks, whereby time becomes, in Johannes Fabian's influential argument, a carrier of significance, a form through which we define the content of relations between the self and the other, and give form to relations of power and inequality. In Against Race, Paul Gilroy describes the Enlightenment origins of what Fabian calls the denial of coevalness to racialized others, showing how Kant and Hegel theorized modernity as mediated by race as both period and region. In their view, while white Europeans were the proper subjects of a teleological history ever moving in the direction of progress, Africans were fundamentally outside of history and thus excluded from participation in social life, understood as not only prehistoric, but pre-political also. This temporal exclusion from the political space of the present was easily transferred to other minoritized subjects, as Valerie Rohe has demonstrated with regard to queerness in Anachronism and its others, and Mark Rifkin has analyzed in the Indigenous context in Beyond Settler Time. By the 20th century, the concepts of race and sexuality had become temporally fixed to produce an understanding of the racialized or queer subject as both excluded from an active or political role in history and as occupying a different point in the historical timeline altogether, from what Rohe describes as the sterility imagined as deathly regression ascribed to queerness against the futural demands of what Lee Edelman has termed reproductive futurism, to the trope of the vanishing Indian that, as Rifkin writes, constitutes one of the principal means of effacing Indigenous sovereignties. It's for this reason that an artwork like Alicia B. Wormsley's There Are Black People in the Future is so disturbing to the white Pittsburgh residents who demanded that her billboard be taken down. To ascribe futurity to Blackness is to go against the entire social edifice that is underpinned by temporal white supremacy. Apocalypse is frightening because it threatens the future. But what if you've always been positioned by the dominant culture as inherently futureless? Does futurelessness look different if your own access to the future has long been sacrificed to ensure the continuity of the social order? If the future doesn't have you in it, Black, queer, native, crip, then how much do you really want it anyway? This manifesto proposes that we think about apocalypse not as the trajectory of a singular timeline towards a fixed ending, the normative time of social reproduction in which the future extends out from the conditions of the present, but rather as an interruption of that timeline that opens up the present to the multi-temporalities of the oppressed. If the dominant culture pairs white hetero-settler futurity with minority futurelessness along a determinately teleological timeline, then cutting out the future from this timeline becomes a way of disrupting the temporal structures that organize social domination. This is apocalypse as radical futurelessness, as a formal afuturity that transfigures the present. Think about it this way. When we want to save the future, when we fear apocalypse, it produces conservative impulses in the present. We see the future as something that exists out there in front of us, something desirable, something that should be protected from the apocalypse that threatens to destroy it. Any Hollywood movie that harvests its dramatic tension from the imminent destruction of the world by asteroid, alien, or virus serves as an example of this kind of futurity. It also appears in negative form in eco-apocalyptic works such as Cormac McCarthy's The Road and Christopher Nolan's Interstellar that mourn the passing of that potential future by depicting elegiacally the final days of a dying world. In texts such as these, a determination to save the future works simultaneously to invest the present with a vulnerability that is essentially conservative, When McCarthy's protagonists have a quasi-mystical encounter with a can of Coke, it makes readers clutch their Coke cans a little tighter, newly aware of the possibility of their loss. A conservationist attitude towards an imagined yet valued future also organizes much of progressive politics in both activism and theory. As Robin Wiegman wrote of feminism's apocalyptic futures in 2000, movements that rely on an affective attachment to what we are progressing towards often find themselves experiencing the hyperbolic anxiety that the future may now be unattainable because the present fails to bring the past to utopic completion. In such cases, the drive to save a future in which one has invested one's dreams becomes a kind of limit on the kinds of presents that feel acceptable, unfailed, with the result that only the past's futures become worth fighting for. What does it mean to want to save the future? Think about the fact that the dominant social order thinks of you as futureless at best and as a threat to the future of the social order at worst. Think about whether the future has anything to offer you, or if the future for you offers only attrition. Think about what happens if you let the future go. Taken in this context, apocalypse as radical a futurity becomes visible as a targeted intervention into the social temporalities that structure and perpetuate the structural violence of the present. Where oppressive chronopolitics seek to fix the potential meanings and implotments of subaltern subjects, apocalypse as futurelessness restores a liberatory flexibility of both to the present. Tony K. Bambara's 1980 novel, The Salt Eaters, exemplifies such an emancipatory transfiguration. The world of Bambara's novel is one that is structured by environmental as well as other kinds of racism. The Black community of Claiborne is situated next to a nuclear power plant, and unmarked trucks regularly carry radioactive waste through the center of town. The town's medical clinic and educational centers have been built to counter unequal access to healthcare and schools. And the story is built around the healing of Velma, an activist whose spirit has been fractured by the never-ending nature of the struggle for justice. Throughout the novel, Bambara juxtaposes the linear teleological time of dominant temporalities with both deep circular connections to African and indigenous pasts and anti-futural emanations of nuclear apocalypse. In the most intensely suicidal moment of her breakdown, for example, Velma longs to become an hourglass, to be that sealed, sound, taste, air, nothing seeping in, to pour herself grain by grain into the top globe and sift silently down to a heap in the bottom one. Identical and sequential, the time of the hourglass that Velma longs to lose herself into is the manifested temporality of the homogeneous empty time of the oppressive state. Similarly, the progress temporality of Western scientific modernity is characterized in microcosm by the board game that Campbell, a cafe worker and nuclear issues writer, develops after hearing nuclear engineers from the power plant talking about their work. Disposal captures the innovating routines required to stay one step ahead of unruly nuclear materials. Each square represents a storage location, but each location necessitates another move merely to stay in the game. Trench, but one had to move within the next throw before the food chain was affected. Storage plant, but there was a card announcing buildup which obliged the player to move off the spot. Disposal embodies the empty teleology of the world of Western scientism, as pieces move around the board in a single direction that in the end leads them nowhere. Both of these images and temporalities are exploded in the apocalyptic transfiguration of the world that takes place at the end of the novel. Something that might be a storm also appears to be more. A grumbling, growling, boiling up as if from the core of the earthworks drew a groan from the crowd huddled together under the awning in the doorway, as if to absorb the shock of it, whatever cataclysmic event it might turn out to be, for it couldn't be simply a storm with such frightening thunder as was cracking the air, as if the very world was splitting apart. This splitting apart of the world, a transition of the world and grammar of the novel into the apocalyptic mode, produces a multiplicity of figurations and a constant switching between them, transfiguration. The final event is one yet multiple. It is an accident at the plant, an atom bomb dropping, the destruction of the earth by the gods, the energy released by Velma's healing, an environmental disaster. Each of these figures of apocalypse is equally real to the text at the moment that it is being narrated. This multiplicity of figuration signifies in the text the arrival, through the arrival of an apocalyptic futurelessness, of new possibilities in formation, a new configuration to move with. The imminent end of the world suspends the teleological forward drive of the hourglass and the board game. Rain, delay, new possibilities in formation, a new configuration to move with. The ending of the novel can seem jarring, switching genres into something like sci-fi as it incorporates radically new potentialities within the present, added to the inventory of ways that Velma could have died before this, at birth, in a fire, and now potential deaths in a resource war over burial grounds or by feral child attack. The apocalyptic scenario is not the real future of the novel, however, but rather the suspension of futural definitions of possibility to produce the new possibilities in formation that transfigure the experience of the present to include such outlandish potentials. By suspending the trajectory of the social and its objects, Bambara restores a politically vital dimension of contingency to lived sensations of reality, a sense of the otherwiseness imminent to the world as it is. Apocalypse emerges here as a way of inhabiting a provisional life structure in the present, a way of making the present always provisional, contingent, changeable. Bambara deploys an apocalyptic implotment to produce a shift from the politics of fulfillment to the politics of transfiguration, an opposition theorized by the philosopher and social theorist Salah Ben Habib. According to Ben Habib, the politics of fulfillment envisages that the society of the future attains more adequately what present society has left unaccomplished. It is the culmination of the implicit logic of the present. Conversely, the politics of transfiguration emphasizes the emergence of qualitatively new needs, social relations, and modes of association. For most of the Salt Eaters, the activist characters are working to ameliorate the existing conditions of the social world within the logic of the politics of fulfillment. The arrival of the apocalyptic horizon of ecological futurelessness, however, produces in the novel the qualitatively new imaginaries that define the politics of transfiguration. While Ben Habib does not engage with apocalypse directly, she does draw on Marx and the Frankfurt School thinkers in a way that suggests apocalypse as one mode of access to transfiguration. The term transfiguration, she writes, is intended to suggest that emancipation signifies a radical and qualitative break with some aspects of the present. In certain fundamental ways, the society of the future is viewed to be not the culmination, but the radical negation of the present. As a temporal form that negates both the future and the present's claim upon the future, apocalypse facilitates the politics of transfiguration, as under its futural foreclosures, the present begins to imagine itself otherwise. The transfiguration of the present under the sign of futurelessness also suggests an ethical reorientation to contemporary social theories thinking about the future. In The Future as Cultural Fact, Arjuna Padurai proposes two opposing ethics of the future: the ethics of probability, a bad risk-assessing disaster capitalism, and the ethics of possibility, a good aspirational progressive politics of hope. Juxtaposing Padurai's theoretical framework with Ben Habib's, however, reveals the similarities rather than the differences between the two sides of his binary opposition. The progressive vision of the ethics of possibility and the risk analysis approach of the ethics of probability are both examples of a politics of fulfillment, a present that seeks to ameliorate itself by gradual change into an imaginable future. Bambara's novel makes the limits of such a politics clear, as Velma's capacity for emancipatory struggle is slowly stifled by remaining trapped within the imaginative limits of an oppressive world. The transfigurative apocalypse at the end of The Salt Eaters conjures a present that is oriented neither towards a probable future nor a possible one, but rather towards a set of impossible futures. It suggests that subaltern justice demands an ethics of impossibility, oriented towards the abjected outside of our capacity to think the social future, a life lived to produce liberation that we consistently fail to imagine, but work to bring about anyway. Bambara captures this sense of impossible action beautifully elsewhere when discussing Black women's activism. I despair of our failure to wrest power from those who have it and abuse it, our reluctance to reclaim our old powers lying dormant with neglect, our hesitancy to create new powers in areas where it never before existed. And I'm euphoric because everything in our history, our spirit, our daily genius suggests we do it. The ethics of impossibility implies those ways of thinking, feeling, and acting that are not guided by what seems possible or probable in the collective vision of the future. It is designed instead to orient towards those who the collective future tends to exclude, the Black, queer, Indigenous, disabled, and other subjects who are always already marked as futureless and whose futures are inequitably threatened by the apocalypses unfolding all around us. This manifesto aims to intervene in a central problem in contemporary environmental and social theory. How counter-hegemonic work can continue when all avenues of possibility appear to be foreclosed. As late capitalism grinds inexorably on, as more and more lives are precarious, as the protections and promises of liberalism become increasingly hollow, as overt white supremacy seizes power, and as the irreversible environmental catastrophes of climate change, toxification, and the sixth mass extinction project an uncertain future for life itself, the affective function of hope and a belief in progress come under increasing pressure. This is hard, as all of us know. It's hard to keep working when you don't know what you're working for. It's hard to keep working when you don't feel optimistic about your chances of generating change. It's hard to invest in action that doesn't fit into a narrative of amelioration, that doesn't promise that things will get better. Futurelessness is not a politics that feels empowered, agential, directional. Anna Singh takes up this problem in The Mushroom at the End of the World. We think that we have grown out of progress narratives, left them in the last century where they belong, but at the same time, she writes, progress felt great. There was always something better ahead. Progress gave us the progressive political causes with which I grew up. I hardly know how to think about justice without progress. Progress is how we know how to feel good, and progress requires futurity. It's hard for me to even say this, Singh writes. There might not be a collective happy ending. I know what I'm asking. In Conscripts of Modernity, David Scott describes the crisis of post-colonial politics after Bandung, when the horizon of utopian possibility that had defined earlier anti-colonial movements seemed to contract into a dead-end present, what Raymond Williams described in reference to modern tragedy as the loss of hope, the slowly settling loss of any acceptable future. This state of mind is both shared by us and intolerable to us for all of the reasons described above. Scott diagnoses it, but his project is explicitly to find a way to get out of it. Mine is not. I'm asking us to stay there, to see what apocalyptic transfigurations of the world might be produced if we ceased to be oriented towards a futural horizon, even if it doesn't feel good, even if it can't sustain the momentary punk euphoria of Edelman's fuck everything, and for the most part is kind of depressing, even if it means by definition that we can never get anywhere. The wager that I make is that radical apocalypticism, a commitment to struggle in a present that is oriented to futurelessness rather than to survival, an apocalypticism that interrupts teleologies rather than reproducing them, produces valuable forms of work, thought, solidarity, and care. When we turn our focus away from organizing what seems possible to achieve in the future, other orientations become possible. An ethical orientation, for instance, in which we fight for abolition, not because it seems plausible, but because white supremacist police brutality is profoundly wrong. Our times have always been impossible to the order that orders time. We are impossible subjects, futureless, doomed. Apocalypse is where we live. The message of this manifesto is lean way in, take up futurelessness as a place to stand, fight without hope, flourish without the possibility of flourishing, pluck time's arrow from the sky and see how time opens up around you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jess, for that really fascinating and also deeply radical talk. Thank you to both our speakers for such generative papers. I'm going to try to formulate a question that speaks to both your talks, and then I'd like to open it up to Q&A to the floor. So please feel free to type your questions into the Q&A function, and then we'll get to them. So what I enjoyed about both your talks is the reminder of how dominant notions of time and temporality, and by extension, our understanding of futures and futurity itself, need to be deeply politicized, racialized, and then rethought. That some are allowed future making, and yet others are made to occupy temporal fixity. What I enjoyed is how both papers did not attempt to prescribe futures or suggest what that would look like, itself a practice of colonial teleology, but to ask the usefulness of the concept of future and futurity itself, finding thinking in such terms settler colonial concepts of teleology and historicism. The future as an extension of linear historicism must be troubled, and in addition, the notion of whose futures we inhabit and we have become accustomed to seeing as our own or as ideal must be problematized in order for us to imagine otherwise. Or as Jess so eloquently puts it, what if you've always been positioned by the dominant culture as inherently futureless? Does futurelessness look different if your own access to the future has long been sacrificed to ensure the continuity of social order? If the future doesn't have you in it, how much do you really want it anyway? As media scholar Carly Simmons puts it, the apocalypse has already happened to Indigenous peoples. So perhaps the question is not how do we create accessible futures, a question which assumes rather than unseats dominant teleologies of progress and modernity in racial capitalism, that assumes the future culmination of an implicit logic of an already problematic present. Perhaps the question should then be, how do we live amid foreclosed futures? Can we find new forms of temporality through new insurgent solidarities, as TJ suggests, and what would they look like? Or should we embrace an interruptive apocalypticism, as Hurley describes? I'd like to take the opportunity for a bit of cross-fertilization by putting these two possibilities in conversation. For TJ, is the idea of radical futurelessness something that comes up in your work on the aesthetics of abolition ecology? And here I'm thinking through, what you talked about with regard to sort of relinquishing settler futurity and finding that deep incommensurability in settler futurities. Were there moments where inhabiting futurelessness was in fact a space for agency? And for Jess, is there anything in the text that you look at, and I know you look at a great many in the larger book, that offer other ways of imagining temporality, perhaps in non-teleological ways, so that we need not inhabit the depressing and hopeless space of futurelessness, but can instead think about other ways of imagining beyond an apocalypse?
Thanks, Nadine. That's a really substantial question, and it helps to bring out some of the connections actually between what I thought were two presentations that might seem at odds in some ways, and maybe like rhetorically in certain elements they are, at least where the emphasis is. But I don't think actually they're, I don't know, maybe just I'll be interested to hear what you have to say, but maybe they're not directly oppositional and even support each other. Certainly, I think that was part of my attempt to think about futurity in this presentation. That first of all, there's the future just, it doesn't exist as such. It's deeply embedded within situated practices and embodied relationalities and ideological and political positions. It's historical. We're doing some work of historicizing the future, as many other people have been doing. So there's definitely a big part of the political traction that I'm trying to develop in my approach that is about abolition in its negative forcefulness. So that means negating a certain element of futurity, especially, as you said, Nadine, like settler futurity, white supremacist futurity, capitalist futurity, extractive, colonial and racial capitalist futurity. All that stuff, I think that's where we indeed have to commit to a certain understanding of apocalypse. We have to be active agents in bringing apocalypse about, in continuing the project of ending the world. As strange and bizarre as that may seem, right? We don't, like, there's some worlds we don't want to live in them, even though some of us may benefit because of how we were, how we're situated historically, how we raised, how we've been embodied in that world with all the privileges associated with it. But nevertheless, I think politically it's important to commit to abolishing that stuff. For me, I'm trying to also bring about something that is hopeful, but again, where there's no such thing as any kind of simple understanding or approach to hope itself, right? It's incredibly problematic, and there's lots of, I think, convincing, compelling reasons to challenge certain understandings of hope as progressivist, as linear, as utopian. So I think we're at a time where we absolutely need the complexity of language, like people like Kim Stanley Robinson provide, or Jameson, like an anti-utopian utopianism, or a pessimistic optimism, or something that, like I don't know if, Jess, if you've looked at Invisible Committee, their book Now, right? This is another kind of a manifesto for futurelessness, for like fuck the future, because it's just, it's already constructed and defined in advance according to deeply discriminatory and ideological and politically oppressive forms. So that's something we definitely have to reject. But I don't want to give up, though, myself, and also in terms of my practice, writing, teaching, and also as an activist and organizer, increasingly, of hope as an actual material embodied practice in everyday life that's collectivist, that's about building solidarity, that's trying to make a way to live amidst the ruins in a way that's different from racial and colonial capitalism.
Yes to everything that you both just said. Yeah, I mean, I'll start at the very end with thinking about hope. I definitely still believe in it sometimes as a useful thing that we should have. And I think that part of where my project really kind of got off the ground was in looking at how James Baldwin in particular was writing in the post-civil rights era, which was this moment of kind of profound hopelessness for him and for the movement in general, which raised this question, right, of like, okay, if you don't have hope, how do you keep going, right? Do you stop doing the work because you no longer have hope for it? But that wasn't what happened with any of those people, with Baldwin or any of the people who were kind of living in that moment with him. So part of my project here was to figure out, like, okay, what keeps people going in the absence of hope? It must be something that we don't have a name for in this way, right? Like we assume that the reason that anyone does activist or liberatory work is because they have hope for the future. But then what happens if you lose it? What happens when we find ourselves in these moments where everything just feels incredibly hopeless? Something else has to come in, right, and provide that kind of motivation, or be able to be seen in retrospect as a kind of a different epistemology for thinking about why act. And sometimes I think it is just ethics, right? Like, which is something I feel like is the thing that gets sacrificed when we talk about hope for specific kinds of changes. It gets immediately tied into, well, we do this because we have hope that we can do it, rather than we're doing this because I am profoundly ethically moved by the problem that we have. I have no idea if we can do it or not, but I cannot live with this situation as it currently is. I can't accept it. To go to Nadine's point about are there kind of non-teleological ways of imagining futurity, or how we kind of live in time? One of the things that's been most interesting to me about doing this work is that apocalypse itself has so many temporal forms in different historical moments in different communities, right? Like we assume that we have this kind of Genesis to Revelation model, and that's widely shared, but it's absolutely not. So one aspect of it is the kind of future colonizing, new heaven and new earth version of it that's so tightly bound up with colonizing the new world, right? That Columbus literally set out being like, I'm going to find the new heaven and the new earth and bring about this kind of apocalyptic reality. And ever since, this idea that we'll just wipe the slate clean and start again has been an amazingly kind of white supremacist and colonialist form of apocalypse. But that's definitely not the only one out there. So when I was working on Baldwin and Samuel Delaney and that kind of post-civil rights era, apocalypse was showing up in a much more liberatory form, right? That this was going to be the end of these restrictive practices and a way to, I think, specifically try and think about a future that didn't abandon the past, like didn't wipe the slate clean, was a major difference there, but that also wasn't fully determined by the past, right? Like, what do you do with your past if your past is one of genocide? How do you find a way to kind of treasure your ancestors, treasure your past, and bring it into the future in a way that you can still not have it decide everywhere else that you're going to go? In the chapter on the AIDS crisis, apocalypse kind of emerged as this temporal space where the living and the dead could coexist, but rather than having to leave your dead behind and fully commit to a kind of yay futurism position, it was a way to treasure the people that you'd lost. And in the nuclear waste and indigenous literature chapter, apocalypse became a kind of deep time phenomenon where indigenous writers were aligning themselves with nuclear waste materials and being like, we both are going to be here in thousands of years. I have my doubts about you, colonial occupiers. So very, very different forms of futurity, and like there are multiple different ways of imagining no future, just as there are multiple different ways of imagining a future, which I like because it leaves room for a kind of strategic movement between them, that you can take what you need at any moment. If you happen to have hope in your arsenal at any one moment, great, use it. If you don't, there are other things that you can draw on to keep you going. And I think the older I get, the more I appreciate the value of having a kind of diversified arsenal for building community, building solidarity, keeping on doing the work.
I love where this has taken us, because my next question had to do with hope already, and it's been answered. I mean, to desire and to hope is itself an act of future thinking, right? It happens in the future tense, but there's almost something to acquiesce and about it, to predicate it, as it were, on sort of linear thinking. And I think you both addressed that really well. So okay, at this point, I do want to open up questions to our audience. So feel free to kind of type them in to the Q&A, and maybe we'll give people a couple of minutes to do that.
Can I add something, Nadine?
Sure, yes.
I'm just, trying to think with Jessica's proposition, and also in relationship to my work. I think like something I wanted to emphasize is in what I'm calling radical futurism, is the necessarily indeterminate quality of what I was referring to as future. And Jess is also doing that in terms of the present or the now. And I think this is really crucial and opens up a way to theoretically connect the two positions, I think. Because when we're talking about a future that is necessarily indeterminate, it means that we, while we might think and hope of somewhere where we want to get to, we will not be the same then as we are now. So in a way, it's like, it's not, like the fact that it's nonlinear is really crucial to opening up a different relationship to time or duration, where, again, like the way I'm referring to radical futurism and the way Jess is critiquing or rejecting futurity there are really two very different approaches to that F word. And so, you know, if we look beyond the terminology, I think there's so many conceptual and theoretical and methodological, there's so much symbiosis between the two views. So that's how I'm feeling right now in relationship to this.
Yeah, definitely. Like the question is always, how do you restore indeterminacy to the present, right? And the day, because otherwise we're all just so fucked.
Yeah.
It's like, if this is what we have,
Yeah.
how on earth are we supposed to do anything? And part of what is kind of powerful about the future, right, is that any imagining of the future has an enormous power to determine the present, how we think about what things are and how we think about like why we're here and what we're doing. So whether you do that by kind of radically multiplying or changing these predetermined futures, or if you do it by abolishing the future altogether, I think it all comes back to that goal, right, of how do we restore this kind of lived sense of contingency and possibility to the present.
Yeah.
So less about the future at all, perhaps, maybe.
Which is why someone like Octavia Butler, I think, is so crucial and foundational for ways of thinking about this kind of different way of being in the world. So when she comes up with a kind of like theology of transformability, or you know, where she says God is change within her parable series, I think that really lays out in her speculative imagination that kind of approach to I don't know, a futurelessness, maybe in your terms, or a kind of like a radically different way of being with temporality in mind.
Great, brilliant. We have a question from the chair of our department, Eva Wishi. I'll read it out. Thank you both for your inspiring and provocative talks. I was moved by the way that both of you centered literature and visual art within questions of planetary futurity, apocalypse, and ecological politics. I would hear you both articulate what it is about art and its ability to reorder, imagine, embody, or enact what is impossible in other realms that makes you explore these questions through the primary framework of artistic practice.
That's a great question. TJ, do you want to jump in?
Why don't you go first?
Maybe because mine is like a real narratology deep cut, which may or may not be interesting to broadly cultural studies other people. What I was super interested about when thinking about the texts that I work with, all of which are long, like deeply, deeply long, 600 pages, 800 pages, 1,000 pages, 8 hours for Angels in America, is that they leave you feeling different after you've finished them. They have a kind of immersive, they share a length, they share an immersive quality, and they share a particular kind of genre feature, which is not realism and not speculative fiction. So I came around to this thinking about transfiguration because I was trying to account for this kind of very odd aesthetic practice that I was finding across all of these very different texts that I was looking at, trying to work out, like, they all kind of trying to do the same thing, which took me around in the end to Paul Ricoeur's theory of threefold mimesis, which is not one of his more well-known forms of description, but actually I love it as a way of thinking about what narrative formats in particular can do. So his theory is mimesis 1, we experience the world as implotted in time. Mimesis 2, the narrative text re-implots temporality in its own construction of temporality in the narrative. And then mimesis 3, it comes back out and changes how the reader experiences time through their interaction with the narrative text, which to me is kind of wild, right? This theory of literature that says that an emplotment of time within a fictional narrative can actively change how you experience time in the real world, and it captured, for me, the truth of my experience in reading these novels, that when you finish Almanac of the Dead, you are not seeing the world temporally in the way that you did before. So for me, thinking about narrative as something that literally shapes time and shapes our experience of time is something that other things can't or don't do in the same way as this kind of very targeted intervention into a phenomenological experience of time, which seems to me like a deep and important way of intervening in our social present, given that TJ and I have just argued for ages about how our phenomenological experience of time is deeply bound up in all of these other things.
And for me, let's see, I think it's important to first say, because I'm turning to a lot of artistic practices, that I want to acknowledge that art itself as a category is also deeply conflicted, colonized, institutionalized, commodified. And so that's a site of struggle as well. And I'm trying to, in this recent work, I'm trying to think more about solidarity as a political form of relationality or belonging. And that term, it has to be said, has been largely and frequently, commonly excluded or defutured within the context of especially institutionalized artistic practice, because art institutions, from galleries and museums to magazines and journals, scholarship, exhibition sites, are so immersed within the conditions of, I think, capitalism's individuated subjectivity and its competitive structures and commodified, atomized, alienated subject positions. So I think solidarity is itself crucial as a radical methodology of practice. And what I'm really interested in is art beyond that narrowly conceived understanding of institutionalized practice, where it's really, at its most ambitious, art is about creating. It's about making. It's about making in a way that is worlding. It produces new ways to be and be with others, and not just humans or what we call the human as a category, but beyond the human. How we create new kinds of assemblages of being in common. So I find that like really just compelling, and it gives me a sense of that kind of embodied practice-based, process-based hope, or that situated hopefulness as practice that I want to try to develop. And I think I don't find that in other areas. And I'm thinking of art as making in the broadest sense of what that can mean, not necessarily only what you find in galleries, but the literary, just poetics of being in the broadest sense, or for Glissant, just a poetics of relationality. And I think this is also something that we have to think carefully and critically about within academia also, in terms of narrow disciplinarity and the kinds of instrumentalized research practices that are imposed on us as well. Like, how can we make otherwise? This is what I think is, again, injecting a sense of indeterminacy, but also learning from the traditions of the oppressed, just to bring up Benjamin again. I think this is the guide for how to live otherwise.
Fabulous. I'm glad you raised the point about solidarity as a methodology of practice, because that takes us to I think what will be our final question for today, by Samin Jodan. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your last name. Thank you for the inspiring presentations in envisioning, imagining, an appropriately futureless future. Should the work that needs to be done to enable us to think it be more geared toward engendering communal action, or rather promoting individual liberation? Perhaps both. Is there a balance? Communal action being collective social awakening and movements versus the individual art of self-reflection, individual ethics, actionalizing particular experiences of injustice.
I'll start quickly. I think we have to begin by recognizing that individuality itself is a modern fiction. We're multi-species assemblages, and we have to learn to live otherwise. Individuality is something that is, again, has been imposed on us, and it really limits and narrows our thinking about different ways of being, including being in relation, which is, I think, the originary condition of existence. So how can we, yes, I think absolutely we have to think about a kind of new art of assemblism, according to the artist Jonas Stahl. I think we have to think about how can we produce different kinds of collectivities. I think practice is necessarily social. And how can we then mobilize a different politics based on escaping from the traps of kind of individual directed ethics. So that's a brief approach. That's what I'm trying to do with also with solidarity. You can't have solidarity with one person. There's no sense of an individual who practices solidarity, right? It automatically and necessarily presupposes relationality. So how can we start there as the basis of making other worlds possible? I think that's really a compelling question.
I'm not sure that I really have anything to add to that. Yes, solidarity in everything all the time is the only way, or at least, acknowledging that there's no such thing as an individual not being in relation, and therefore it behooves us to think about the nature of all our relations. And we can think about that from an individual ethical perspective, right? Like, am I in good relation to things according to my ethics? And my ethics might change and develop and grow, and that's awesome if they do, but they will only change in relation. So being just constantly aware of, I guess, a dialectic between the position of the individual and these larger relations, ideally relations of solidarity, but not always, I think, is the way forward.
Which is also, just quickly, of course, a common indigenous demand that we have to restore ethical relationality. And many people are advocating and speaking for this. So I think that's great to end where we began in some ways, by through that decolonial principle, meaning decolonizing individuality as well, and do what we can to reconstruct the possibility of good relations.
Thank you. And I think I lied when I said that was the last question. We have time maybe for very short answers to one final question by Hunter. In what way does language and language as an expression of art and biodiversity play into these ecological futures, in that we are speaking and imagining the language of the colonizer already? Is there a place beyond this foreclosed future where even the language of art we create is through a colonized lens, through the resurgence of indigenous languages and art necessitated by land back? And how does the Future and Futurelessness suggested approach this language biodiversity challenge, given what can be viewed as another already present and growing apocalypse in climate change?
You want a quick answer to that?
A really quick answer.
I don't know if it's possible, but I'll try to be really quick. But I love the expression, we need a world in which many worlds fit, from inspired by the Zapatismo. I think yes, we need to think critically about linguistic colonialism and English as the lingua franca. How can we cultivate multiple languages in the same way that we necessarily have to cultivate biodiversity for our very survival? And so I think in some ways I'm trying to think critically with a similar proposition to a world of many worlds. I think we need a future of many futures, or at least a chronopolitics of multiple approaches to temporality. We need to, in other words, avoid the domination of a one world, and similarly a chronopolitics that's homogeneous or imposed according to a principle of a hegemonic temporality. So multiple languages, absolutely.
I guess I would say that the only way out is through, right? We have to do what we can with the tools that we have. And English is a tool. We can use it as a tool. We can think critically about it. But if we assume that we've already lost the things that could get us to where we want to be, then we have already lost.
Yeah. And I think Santa's question speaks to something that I've also been thinking about in terms of like, you've read Amitav Ghosh's kind of critique about the inability of, realist fictions to kind of capture the improbabilities of climate change, about what do we do when sort of our forms and our media are, for instance, in the case of cinema, too slow to capture a nuclear reaction, too fast to capture glacial ice melt, right? So then what do we do with sort of these mediated forms and tools that are always already limited in that sense? So this is, thank you. This is something to think about. And thank you both so much for joining us. It's been a great conversation, and I've learned a lot. Thank you for the generosity with your thinking and your thoughts as well. I'd like to thank also Laura, Eileen, Kate, and Eve for making this event happen, and to all of you for attending. Do check out our website for a schedule of future events on the topic of futurity and future publics. So with that, I'd like to say have a great Friday, and thanks again for joining us today.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.